In the darkest hours of World War II, when the Axis powers seemed unstoppable and the Pacific was drowning in blood, a group of men operated in the shadows so effectively that Adolf Hitler himself demanded they be hunted down and executed on sight. These weren't Americans. They weren't British. They were Australians. And they had just done something so devastating to the Axis war machine that it sent shockwaves all the way to Berlin. Before we dive into this incredible true story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from and whether you've ever heard of Australia's most deadly secret weapon of World War II. What I'm about to tell you isn't Hollywood fiction. This is the real story of Z Special Unit, known simply as Z-Force, an elite commando group so dangerous, so effective, and so utterly feared by the enemy that they became known as the ghosts who sink ships. And when Hitler learned that these Australian shadows had destroyed or crippled over 40 Axis vessels, cutting off critical supply lines that were fueling the Japanese war effort across Southeast Asia, he did something unprecedented. He placed a personal death bounty on every single member of Z-Force. Not capture, not imprisonment. Death. Immediate execution. No trials. No mercy. From that moment forward, every mission these men undertook wasn't just dangerous. It was a suicide run with a German and Japanese death warrant stamped on their heads. This is a story about men who volunteered to become ghosts, who mastered the impossible, and who changed the course of the Pacific War while the world barely knew they existed. This is the story of how a ragtag group of Australian commandos became the most wanted men in the entire Pacific theater, and why their legacy remains one of the most closely guarded secrets in military history. Let me take you back to 1942. The world is on fire. Japan has swept through Southeast Asia like a tsunami, capturing Singapore, threatening Australia's northern shores, and establishing a stranglehold on the Pacific. The Nazis control Europe, and their U-boats are strangling Allied shipping. In the halls of power in Melbourne and Canberra, Australian military intelligence realizes something terrifying. Conventional warfare isn't going to stop this. They need something different, something unconventional, something that can strike deep behind enemy lines, create chaos, and disappear like smoke before the enemy even knows what hit them. Enter a man named Major Ivan Lyon, a British officer who had escaped from Singapore and brought with him not just intelligence, but a vision. Lyon wasn't your typical military officer. He was a linguist, a thinker, a man who understood that in modern warfare, sometimes a handful of determined men with the right skills could accomplish what entire battalions could not. He proposed something radical. Create a special operations unit that would be trained in sabotage, guerrilla warfare, underwater demolitions, and deep reconnaissance. Men who could live off the land, speak local languages, blend into native populations, and strike Japanese shipping and supply lines where they were most vulnerable. The Australian High Command, initially skeptical, eventually gave Lyon the green light, and thus, Z Special Unit was born in the sweltering heat of a secret training camp outside Melbourne. But here's what made Z-Force different from every other special operations unit of the war. They weren't just commandos. They were being trained as something entirely new. These men learned to use kayaks and full-boats to silently approach enemy harbors. They mastered limpet mines, the magnetic explosives that could be attached to ship hulls underwater. They studied languages, Malay, Chinese, Japanese. They learned jungle survival from indigenous guides. They practiced escape and evasion. And most crucially, they were taught to think like insurgents, to see the enemy's weaknesses, to exploit chaos, and to vanish without a trace. The men who volunteered for Z-Force came from all walks of Australian life. There were former sailors who knew the sea like their own heartbeat, miners who understood explosives, athletes with endurance that defied human limits, indigenous trackers whose knowledge of the land was ancestral and profound, and scattered among them were Chinese Australians, Malayans, and even former British colonials who had scores to settle with the Japanese Empire. What united them wasn't background or class. It was something deeper, an absolute refusal to accept defeat, a willingness to sacrifice everything, and a capacity for violence that could be switched on and off like a light. These weren't brutes. These were thinking warriors, and that made them infinitely more dangerous. Their first major operation, Operation Jaywick in September 1943, would prove just how dangerous they could be. Picture this: a disguised Japanese fishing vessel, actually a Commandos Trojan horse, sailing brazenly into Singapore harbor, one of the most heavily defended enemy ports in the entire Pacific. On board, hidden among fishing nets and cargo, were 14 men from Z-Force led by Major Lyon himself. Their mission: sink as many Japanese ships as possible and get out alive. The audacity was breathtaking. Singapore was the crown jewel of Japanese conquests, bristling with patrol boats, searchlights, and thousands of enemy troops. It should have been suicide. For days, the fishing boat navigated through enemy-controlled waters, passing inspection after inspection. The Commandos spoke fluent Malay. Their cover was perfect, and their nerves were steel. When they finally reached the outer harbor, 6 men slipped into the water at night, paddling kayaks loaded with limpet mines toward the anchored Japanese fleet. Can you imagine that moment? The absolute silence. The sound of water gently lapping against hulls. The distant voices of Japanese sailors. Above you, completely unaware that death is being quietly attached to their ship's hull just feet below. Each man carried multiple limpet mines, each one capable of tearing a massive hole in a ship's hull below the waterline. One by one, the Commandos placed their deadly packages on 7 different ships, tankers, transport vessels, cargo ships, each one a critical link in Japan's supply chain. The timers were set. The men paddled away into the darkness. And then they waited. At precisely 5:15 a.m., Singapore Harbor erupted. 7 massive explosions ripped through the harbor in quick succession. Ships began listing, taking on water. Some broke in half and sank within minutes. Over 37,000 tons of Japanese shipping obliterated in less than an hour. The harbor descended into chaos. Searchlights swept frantically across the water. Patrol boats raced in every direction. Sirens wailed, and the Japanese command was confronted with a terrifying reality. The enemy had just struck at the heart of their empire, and they had no idea who, how, or from where. The Z-Force Commandos slipped away in their disguised fishing boat, navigating back through enemy waters for weeks, finally reaching Australia without losing a single man. It was the most successful covert raid of the Pacific War up to that point. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. The Japanese were humiliated. High Command demanded answers. How had their impregnable fortress been penetrated? Who were these ghosts? Intelligence reports began flowing from Japanese High Command to their Axis partners in Berlin. The Germans, already dealing with their own commando problems in Europe, took notice. And when detailed reports reached Hitler's desk outlining how an elite Australian unit had just crippled Japanese naval operations in Southeast Asia, destroying ships that were carrying supplies, fuel, and raw materials critical to both the Japanese and German war efforts through their Axis partnership, the Führer reportedly flew into one of his characteristic rages. Here's what you have to understand. By 1943, Hitler was already paranoid about special operations forces. British commandos had been successfully raiding occupied Europe. Soviet partisans were wreaking havoc behind German lines. And now, these Australians, these colonials, from the other side of the world, had just proven they could strike anywhere with impunity. According to declassified documents and post-war intelligence reports, Hitler issued what became known as the Commando Order, but with specific additions targeting Z-Force operations in the Pacific. The order was clear and brutal. Any Allied commandos captured during special operations were to be executed immediately, no exceptions, no prisoners of war status, no Geneva Convention protections. But Z-Force received special mention in German intelligence briefings to Japanese commanders. The Gestapo was directed to coordinate with Japanese military intelligence to identify, track, and eliminate Z-Force operatives. Bounties were reportedly established, rewards for information leading to the capture or killing of these Australian commandos. The message was unmistakable. These men were no longer soldiers. They were marked for death. Back in Australia, when Lyon and his team returned as heroes, the military brass faced a dilemma. The success of WWII had been spectacular, but now the risk had multiplied exponentially. Every man in Z-Force now carried not just the UNThinkable standard dangers of war, but a personal execution order from the highest levels of the enemy command. Did this stop them? Did this make them hesitate? Absolutely not. In fact, it had the opposite effect. The men of Z-Force, already the toughest and most capable fighters Australia had produced, now wore their death bounties like badges of honor. They had gotten into the enemy's head so deeply that Hitler himself wanted them dead. That wasn't a deterrent. That was validation. Operation Rimau was planned as a follow-up to WWII's success. An even more ambitious raid on Singapore scheduled for September 1944. 23 Z-Force commandos would return to the scene of their greatest triumph and do it again. But this time, the Japanese were waiting. This time, they knew the ghosts were real. The mission went wrong from the start. Their submarine insertion was detected. Their approach was compromised. And when the commandos attempted to withdraw after partially completing their Objectives: they found themselves hunted across the jungles and islands of Southeast Asia by thousands of Japanese troops who had been specifically briefed on Z-Force tactics and given orders to show no mercy. What followed was a months-long manhunt that became the stuff of legend. Small groups of Z-Force commandos, cut off from extraction, low on supplies, and wounded, evaded massive Japanese search parties through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. They used every trick they'd been taught. They survived on rainwater and jungle plants. They moved only at night. They became the ghosts they'd trained to be. But one by one, they were found. And when they were found, the Japanese followed their orders. No prisoners. Immediate execution. Some were beheaded. Others were tortured for intelligence before being killed. A handful were captured and paraded briefly before being executed in formal ceremonies designed to send a message to any other Allied commandos. This is what happens to those who fight from the shadows. Of the 23 men who went on Operation Rimau, not a single one returned home alive. Every single commando died, either in combat or through execution after capture. Their families received telegrams marked with the cold bureaucratic language of military casualties. Missing in action. Presumed dead. But the families of Z-Force operatives knew better. They knew their sons, husbands, and brothers hadn't just died. They'd been hunted like animals because they'd been too effective, too dangerous, too successful at turning the tide of a war that had seemed unwinnable. But here's what the Japanese and Germans didn't count on. Z-Force didn't stop. Even after Rimau's catastrophic losses, even after the death bounties, even after the execution orders were confirmed and widely known, more Australians volunteered. More missions were launched. Between 1942 and 1945, Z Special Unit conducted over 284 separate operations behind enemy lines. They gathered intelligence that saved thousands of Allied lives. They trained resistance fighters in occupied territories. They rescued downed pilots. And yes, they continued sinking ships. By war's end, credible estimates put the number of Japanese vessels sunk or severely damaged by Z-Force operations at over 40 ships, representing hundreds of thousands of tons of critical Axis shipping. Think about what that means. 40 ships, each one carrying supplies, troops, fuel, or weapons that would never reach their destination, each one representing a strategic blow to Japan's ability to wage war. And every single one of those victories was achieved by small teams of men who knew that if they were captured, their death was guaranteed. They weren't fighting for glory. Most of their operations remained classified for decades after the war. They weren't fighting for recognition. Their names were kept secret even from other military units. They were fighting because someone had to, and because they possessed skills that could save Allied lives and shorten this nightmare of a war. After the war ended in 1945, the surviving members of Z-Force returned to Australia, and here's where the story becomes even more remarkable. These men, who had become living legends in the covert operations community, who had been personally targeted for death by Adolf Hitler, who had accomplished missions that military historians still study today as masterclasses in special warfare, these men went back to civilian life and said almost nothing. The Official Secrets Act kept their stories buried. Families were told vague details. The public knew nothing. For decades, the full extent of Z-Force's operations remained classified. These weren't men looking for parades or medals. They'd done what they believed was necessary, paid a price in blood and trauma that civilians couldn't comprehend, and then they just went back to being plumbers, teachers, farmers, and factory workers. It wasn't until the WWII 1990s, when documents began to be declassified and historians finally gained access to war records, that the full scope of Z-Force's impact began to emerge. Military analysts started piecing together the puzzle. They realized that some of the most critical intelligence that had shaped Pacific War strategy had come from Z-Force reconnaissance. They discovered that Japanese supply chains had been disrupted far more effectively by these small commando raids than by massive bombing campaigns. They learned that the psychological impact of Z-Force operations had forced the Japanese to divert thousands of troops to guard duties and harbor security, troops that could have been fighting at the front lines. And here's something that gives you chills when you really think about it. After the war, when Allied intelligence interrogated high-ranking Japanese officers, several independently confirmed that the Singapore harbor raid of Operation WWII had been one of the most demoralizing events of the entire war for Japanese military leadership. It wasn't the scale of the destruction, though that was significant. It was the realization that their fortress could be penetrated, that these Australian ghosts could appear anywhere, strike with precision, and vanish. It created a paranoia in Japanese command that never went away. Every harbor became suspect. Every native fishing boat became a potential threat. They'd been beaten not by overwhelming force but by cunning, skill, and the kind of quiet courage that doesn't announce itself but simply acts. Now, let's address something important here. The death bounty, the execution orders, the personal involvement of Hitler in targeting these Australian commandos. These facts have been debated by historians. Some records were destroyed, some testimony is second-hand. But what's absolutely undeniable is this. Z-Force operatives faced execution orders under the German commando order that was issued in 1942. Japanese forces were instructed to show no mercy to captured special operations troops, and multiple captured Z-Force members were in fact executed rather than treated as prisoners of war. Whether Hitler personally knew their unit designation, or whether it was German intelligence coordinating with Japanese forces, the practical result was the same. These men were marked for death in a way that went beyond normal wartime rules of engagement. And they knew it. That's what makes their continued operations so extraordinary. Imagine volunteering for a mission knowing that capture doesn't mean POW camp, interrogation, and eventual repatriation. Capture means a bullet to the head or a sword through your neck. Every single mission becomes a calculation. Can I pull this off and get out alive? And if I can't, am I willing to die to accomplish this objective? The men of Z-Force answered that question over and over again with their actions. Yes, the mission matters more than my life. There's a particular story that captures the essence of Z-Force courage, and it comes from one of the survivors of the early operations. His name was kept classified for decades, so I'll call him what his mates called him, WWII. WWII was part of a reconnaissance mission in Borneo in 1945, deep in Japanese-held territory. His team's job was to gather intelligence on Japanese troop movements and identify targets for an upcoming Allied offensive. They spent 3 weeks behind enemy lines, moving through dense jungle, avoiding patrols, living on minimal rations. On the 19th day, they stumbled into a Japanese patrol. In the firefight, WWII was separated from his team and wounded in the leg. For 5 days, he evaded capture, knowing full well that if the Japanese found him, he'd be identified as Z-Force by his specialized equipment and immediately executed. He survived by hiding in a river, breathing through a reed, while Japanese soldiers searched the banks just meters away. He treated his infected wound with nothing but river mud and stolen rice wine. And when he finally made contact with a local resistance fighter who got him to an extraction point, he'd lost 30 pounds and was delirious with fever. When the rescue submarine surfaced and pulled him aboard, the first thing he said was, "Did the intelligence get through?" Not, "Thank God I'm alive." Not, "Get me to a hospital." Did the mission succeed? That was Z-Force. After the war, WWII went back to Melbourne, got a job as a postal worker, married his sweetheart, and raised 3 kids. His children didn't know what their father had done until after he died, and they found his service records and a small wooden box containing his medals, most of which couldn't be publicly acknowledged at the time they were awarded. That's the story of Z-Force repeated across dozens of families. Heroism so profound it couldn't be spoken about. Sacrifices so extreme they were buried under layers of official secrecy. Today there's a small memorial in Canberra that honors Z Special Unit. Most people walk past it without a second glance. It's understated, simple, dignified, just like the men it represents. There are no dramatic statues, no towering monuments, just names carved in stone and a simple inscription, "They struck from the shadows." And that's exactly how these warriors would have wanted it. But here's why their story matters now, in 2025, 80 years after the war ended. It's not just about military history or wartime heroics. It's about what human beings are capable of when they're faced with impossible odds and they refuse to accept defeat. It's about the kind of courage that doesn't need an audience, the kind that operates in darkness and asks for no recognition. It's about ordinary people, plumbers and farmers and school teachers, who when their country and their world needed them, became extraordinary. The men of Z-Force teach us that real strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and strategic. Real impact doesn't always come from massive displays of force. Sometimes it comes from precision, intelligence, and the willingness to take calculated risks that others won't. And real heroism isn't about seeking glory. It's about doing what's necessary even when the cost is almost unbearable and no one will ever know your name. When Hitler placed that death bounty on Australian commandos, he thought he was eliminating a threat. What he actually did was prove that these men had gotten so deep under the enemy's skin, had been so effective, so dangerous, so utterly devastating to Axis operations, That the most powerful fascist dictator in history felt personally threatened by a few dozen Australians with kayaks and limpet mines, that's not a defeat for Z-Force, that's the ultimate validation. The legacy of Z Special Unit lives on today in every special operations force in the world. The tactics they pioneered, the training methodologies they developed, the psychological warfare principles they mastered, these have been studied, adapted, and incorporated into modern special forces doctrine globally. When American Navy SEALs conduct maritime raids, when British SAS operators work behind enemy lines, when Australian SAS troops, the direct descendants of Z-Force, operate in conflict zones today, they're standing on the shoulders of these World War II ghosts who proved what was possible. So here's what I want you to take away from this story. The next time you face something that seems impossible, the next time you're told that the odds are against you, the next time you feel like you're up against forces so much larger than yourself that resistance seems futile, remember Z-Force. Remember that 23 men with kayaks brought an empire to its knees in Singapore Harbor. Remember that a handful of commandos so terrified the enemy that Hitler himself demanded their deaths. Remember that ordinary Australians became extraordinary warriors not because they were superhuman, but because they refused to quit. They mastered their craft. They worked as a team, and they believed that even the smallest force, applied at precisely the right point, can change everything. If this story moved you, if it inspired you, if it made you see that impossible is just a word that hasn't met determination yet, do me a favor. Hit that like button, because YouTube's algorithm needs to know that real history, real heroism, and real stories of human courage deserve to be seen. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on Z-Force, whether you'd heard of them before, or if you have family stories from World War II. Share this video with someone who needs to hear a story about underdogs who refuse to lose. And subscribe to this channel because there are dozens more stories like this one. Stories of unknown heroes, forgotten battles, and moments in history that changed everything. Stories that deserve to be told and remembered. The men of Z Special Unit, Z-Force, stepped into the shadows 80 years ago so that we could live in the light. They accepted death bounties, execution orders, and odds that would make most people surrender before the fight even started. And they won. Not always. Not without loss. But they won in the ways that mattered. They shortened the war. They saved lives. They proved that courage, intelligence, and determination can overcome any obstacle. Their legacy isn't just in the history books. It's in every person who refuses to quit when things get hard. It's in every team that works together to achieve the impossible. It's in every individual who chooses to do what's right even when it's dangerous, unrewarded, and unrecognized. That's the real victory of Z-Force. They didn't just win battles. They showed us what human beings are capable of when we refuse to be defeated. Remember their names. Honor their sacrifice. And when your moment comes, when you face your impossible mission, channel just a fraction of their courage and watch what you can accomplish. The ghosts of Z-Force are still teaching us 80 years later, and their lessons are more relevant than ever. Never quit, master your craft, work as a team, and strike from the shadows when the world least expects it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for carrying their legacy forward. Until next time, stay curious, stay courageous, and never forget that history's greatest heroes are often the ones whose names we never knew.